Thank you, my lord. Doctor, you know Dr. Anderson well.
I do.
There's no question whatever about Dr. Anderson's eminent qualifications.
In my opinion, there's no question.
And about the frankness and integrity with which he would give his evidence to any court.
Agreed.
If Dr. Anderson had expressed a pessimistic view, it would only be because that was his view.
Yes.
Now, Doctor, we dealt with the question of the condition of a person who has a malignant tumor. Is it not true that sometimes tumors are more virulent in younger and stronger persons than they are in older people?
That is true for certain types of tumors that occur in young people. There are, though, types of tumors which occur in old people that are just as virulent. It depends rather on the type of tumor rather than on the age at which it develops.
All right, Doctor. Then am I not correct in saying that there is no general rule that because a person is younger, healthier, and more vigorous, the tumor is less likely to be virulent or spread more rapidly?
My previous opinion, which I will offer again, is that anybody afflicted with a tumor, the better his general health, the better his chance of naturally resisting the tumor, and the better his chance of resisting the rigors of treatment.
Unless it were a tumor which spreads more rapidly in a younger person.
That is true for a type of tumor which occurs in young people. To this extent that in that group of young people, the more robust and healthy the individual, the better his chances of being able to accept the treatment even for a virulent tumor.
I wasn't dealing at the moment, Doctor, with his capacity to stand what you've described as the rigors of treatment. And just the word is pretty ominous. Apart from his capacity to withstand the rigors of treatment, the actual growth of the tumor may be more rapid in a younger person, certain types of tumors.
Certain types of tumors, yes, but insofar as myeloma is concerned, I don't know of any correlation between rate of growth and age of patient.
Thank you, Doctor. Now, Doctor, we know that Mr. Paget's tumor was detected because of an autopsy.
Yes.
It would likely have been detected only in some accidental way for some considerable time. Is that not correct?
Yes, its detection would have been accidental up until the point at which it produced a symptom to direct his attention to it.
Yes, Doctor. And it's likely, altogether likely, that it would have progressed considerably beyond the stage at which it was detected, at the point at which it manifested itself by some symptom or symptoms.
The time for it to manifest itself in terms of a symptom or some other evidence of progression, I have really no justification for placing a finite period of time on that interval.
I wasn't asking you to do anything like that, Doctor, only to agree with me that it was altogether probable that it would have been as a result of some progression of the disease that it was detected if it hadn't been detected in some accidental way.
Yes.
Thank you, Doctor. And you did tell my learned friend that early treatment is of significance in the treatment of this disease.
Yes.
Now, Doctor, you'll agree with me that figures, I hope, such as 26 years and 19 years are pretty unusual in this disease, survival for that period of time.
Yes, I would say that is true.
And you did say, if I recall correctly, that you would modify Dr. Anderson's figure of 3 to 4 years to a figure of 5 years for an average.
Yes, that is based on information collected between the 20s and the 50s.
And you would add something to that, and if I recall correctly, you didn't say what, but you would add something to that because the figures still include figures from a time when treatment was not as good as it is at the present time.
Yes.
And that is the only figure that you have given for an average survival, if I recall correctly. I'm asking you to help me recall now.
Yes, that is what is generally termed the average, or very frequently called the median survival, the survival at which half of the patients under study have died.
Thank you, Doctor. That's all my Lord.
Re-examination.
No further questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Meeker. Do you have any other witnesses in reply, Mr. Goudie?
That's my only reply evidence, Mark.
Thank you. Mr. FitzPatrick, are you prepared to address the jury now?
Yes, thank you, my Lord.
Thank you.
May it please you, my Lord, gentlemen of the jury. As you know, I represent Mr. Bright, the defendant in this action, and it is now his right and my duty to speak to you and to present his case to you. You are the triers of the fact, and you are now fulfilling a tremendously important role in our system of law. It isn't a perfect system of law because there are very few perfect things in this imperfect world of ours. And it may or may not be that you will decide that the late Mr. Paget was one of the only ones in it. It's still, I submit to you, the best system of law and justice that there has ever been. You have doubtlessly, throughout your lives, heard about what happens to people when they come to court, whether they are people who have been charged with offenses or people who take their civil rights into a court of law to be determined. And you may have heard about the disadvantage at which the small or common man finds himself in a court of law, unable to get a great or prominent counsel, fighting against a large, powerful, and rich corporation. But you know today, and you know today in a way that you could never know at any other time, unless you've been jurors before, that the rights of men who have a right of trial by jury and of women are safeguarded by you today and on other days by their fellow citizens, their peers, by whom they are tried and who look after their rights in a way that you are going to see that the rights of the people before you are looked after. Every time you bring in a verdict, every time a jury brings in a verdict, in accordance with the evidence as it has sworn to do, there's another brick in the structure of our system of justice. And every time a jury brings in a verdict which is not in accordance with the evidence, which is based upon some whim, some sympathy, something other than the law, the truth, and the evidence which has been presented before it, then in some little way our system is undermined. And if that were to take place to any significant degree, there would be a grave danger that we lose one of the great rights of the social order under which we live, the right to have a trial by jury. Now, gentlemen, I'm sure that there's nothing that you will do that will in any way impair the rights of our citizens to a trial by jury, because you've taken your oath, and you as gentlemen of conscience will do your best to abide by your oath to the best of your ability. It isn't an easy case to present, and it isn't an easy case for you to try, because there are certain elements in it which any human being would find his emotions involved. You have before you a widow who has sadly lost her husband. His lordship will tell you that what she is entitled to as a matter of law is the amount of money which will come closest to putting her in the same position financially that she would have been had her husband lived. She's lost a reasonable expectation of pecuniary benefit. And without considering now whose fault it is, you are to assess her damages based on what that loss is. And afterwards, we'll deal with the question of who should pay for it. But dealing just now with the amount of money or the expectation of which she has lost, you will have to direct your minds to what that amount is. And again, in a very painful way, you will have to think about what this man's prospects in life really were at the time he was killed. And it's my submission to you that it's your duty to do so in a hard-nosed and realistic way, not affected by any fear or emotional involvement for anyone. I'm sure that his lordship will speak to you about this. I want you to try very hard to remember what is submitted to you at this time, because my learned friend will speak to you later as is his right, and with the tremendous tactical advantage of going after me. So please try to remember these things. Please try at that time to keep in mind the fact that Mr. Bright is entitled to all your consideration, all your fairness, as is Mrs. Paget. Now, gentlemen, with respect to the amount of money that Mrs. Paget probably lost by her husband's death, you will have to take a very realistic look at the evidence which was given, firstly by Dr. Anderson, and then by the other doctor from Princess Margaret who spoke to you. Dr. Anderson told you that on a statistical basis, the average time that a man has lived since they've been keeping those statistics after the discovery that he had myeloma was 3 or 4 years. Now, it's true that Mr. Paget's myeloma was discovered only by accident. And if Mr. Paget were to become a statistic, so that the length of time that he lived with this condition or disease were kept, then the time would not have started to run at the time of his accident because his condition hadn't yet been diagnosed. Therefore, you should add something to the 3 or 4 years of Dr. Anderson to allow for the fact that that time had not yet begun to run. And it might have been a year, or it might have been 2 years before that period would commence to run, before Mr. Paget's condition would manifest itself in symptoms or be found in some other accidental way, as it was by the autopsy. Now, against that, it's my submission to you that you should weigh off this. Dr. Meekin, who is the eminent physician from the Princess Margaret Hospital, who really only modified Dr. Anderson's evidence about the average time that a person lives after the diagnosis of myeloma by 1 year. He said that bringing those figures up to date, in his opinion, based on a number of statistical works, it was now 5 years. But he stated that it was significant, it was important that a person with this condition receive early treatment. The prognosis is changed by the early treatment. It isn't at all likely that Mr. Paget's condition was going to be diagnosed so that he would ever get treatment in the condition that he was in at the time of that accident. Because unless he had an accidental X-ray entirely unrelated to any symptoms which would disclose this condition, it wouldn't be disclosed until his symptoms had manifested themselves, which they wouldn't do until his condition had seriously progressed and deteriorated, at which time the chances of successful treatment would be significantly depreciated. Now, gentlemen, you will have to decide somewhere a little longer than 5 years is the time, the probable time, that Mr. Paget had to live. If you will remember, almost the last answer that Dr. Meekin gave was that he hadn't used any figure higher than 5 years for an average time. He also conceded, if you will recall, that the figures that he used, such as 15 and 19 years, were the exception. There's an old saying that the exception proves the rule. But you, gentlemen, as his lordship will tell you, are here to base your decision, your verdict, your findings, not on the exceptions, but on the balance of probabilities. Not what was possibly going to occur, but what was probably going to occur. Now, gentlemen, you heard about Mr. Paget's earnings. You heard about his position and that he was in at the time of his death, and you heard to what position he might have progressed. Mrs. Paget described him as a tremendously able and a brilliant man, as a man extremely healthy. And you will have to consider whether you should, as reasonable men, find that Mr. Paget was the kind of a man, a loving, an emotional, and now tearful wife thinks of him as being, or whether he was more accurately appraised by his employer, who said that he was a good, conscientious, and able employee. But he said also he wasn't aggressive, and he said also he obviously wasn't partnership material. Now, gentlemen, it's my respectful submission to you that in assessing what Mr. Paget's prospects were, you will have to weigh that assessment of him against a much more extravagant assessment made by his wife. Now, in that regard, and in assessing the evidence that Mrs. Paget has given throughout, both about the prospects of her husband, the kind of a husband he was, the kind of a father he was, you will have to bring to bear in the evaluation that you make your general experience and knowledge as men of common sense, reason, and experience. And in assessing the evidence of Mrs. Paget, it's my submission to you that you should keep in mind some of the words that she used. Mr. Paget wasn't a normal, healthy man. He was an extremely healthy man. She has been an extremely healthy woman, and her relationship with her husband wasn't a good and loving relationship. It was, gentlemen, a perfect relationship. Now, gentlemen, you'll have to take into account from your experience of this imperfect world how accurate an assessment that was, or how emotional an assessment that was. The late Mr. Paget's relationship with his children was also a perfect relationship. Even as teenagers, in seeking to discipline them, to raise them as a loving and kind parent, dutiful parent, ought to, even in seeking to discipline them, he only had to deal with such minor matters as whether they had come in at 5 o'clock instead of 4 o'clock from school, and apart from that, had no difficulties with these children as teenagers. Well, gentlemen, I ask you to assess how reasonable that is. Not that his relationship with his children is really an issue before you. Not that I suggest in the slightest way that he wasn't a good and kind father. I'm asking you to assess Mrs. Paget's evidence and how objective, how dispassionate is, or how much is it the evidence of a deeply involved and emotional woman. Now, gentlemen, wouldn't that same deep involvement and that same emotion play just as strong a part in the picture that she conjures in her mind and conjures up for you in this courtroom as to what happened on the highway that night. Just think of some of the things that she told you about. That she stood between the two taillights of the car for 15 minutes without moving. Now, there would be no reason for her not to move, but she stayed there without moving. What one of you would stand in one position watching someone fulfill a job without walking up and down, without walking out to look around, without just pacing back and forward? Does that appeal to you as being reasonable, or does it appeal to you as being the way an emotional person thinks of this having happened? Now, if you will, please cast your mind back to when I tried to elicit from Mrs. Paget whether or not she had observed her husband look to see if he could get his car further off the road. That he could have gotten his car further off the road is abundantly clear from the evidence of the sergeant of police who investigated the accident. He told that there was 5 feet of shoulder that the car could have been placed on. It was, in fact, 3.5 feet onto the roadway, leaving 2.5 feet of it on the 5 feet of the shoulder. It could have gone a good 2.5 feet further off. There was a laneway 100 feet further to the west. And you could see a farmhouse with its lights up this laneway. If Mr. Paget had stopped his car, looked around, and gotten in and driven his car to a place of safety, this accident would never have happened. Now, gentlemen, what happened as he pulled up? Mrs. Paget told you that. He pulled up and stopped. He let his car come to a normal stop, and he got out, and he started to change the tire. He at no time changed the position of the car from he first stopped. Would, of course, have been reasonable, in my submission to you, for him to get out, to look about, to find out the proper place to put his car, and to put it there, and then change his tire. Instead of that, he left himself in a position of desperate danger without posting his wife as a lookout and without watching himself for his own safety. Now, gentlemen, I digressed a bit from first having asked you to cast your mind back to the answer that I got from Mrs. Paget when I asked her if she had seen if her husband looked about to see if the car could be gotten further off the road or to a place of safety. Maybe you will recall, and maybe if you don't now, you will when I remind you of it. Mrs. Paget never did make any answer as to whether or not she had seen her husband look. We dealt with it for a considerable period of time, and we finally left it without ever having received any answer to that simple question, because Mrs. Paget insisted on answering that in a number of ways, none of which were responsive to the question that I had asked her. Now, don't misunderstand me. I'm not trying to say that this is a terrible thing, or that it isn't a normal thing for a woman to react in this way. I'm just especially a woman who has lost her husband under such traumatic circumstances. But I'm asking you to use it as an indication of whether or not this woman is able today to come to this court and tell you with reasonable and objective accuracy what actually took place on that evening. Now, gentlemen, do you think that Mrs. Paget stood between these two lights for 15 minutes without ever obscuring one or the other of them, or do you think it's more reasonable that any human being standing in this position for that period of time might move back and forward so as to at times obscure one or the other of the taillights. Now, gentlemen, there's a tremendous difference in the chance of it bringing to attention an oncoming motorist, that there's something there, whether a light is on the traveled portion of the road or whether a light is off on the shoulder of the road. A light on the shoulder of the road is, I submit, not an instant signal of danger, but a red light on the traveled portion of the road is an instant signal of danger. Now, it's open to you in my submission to draw as a reasonable inference the fact that the reason Mr. Bright didn't see the left rear light of the Paget car is that Mrs. Paget was, at the critical moment, obscuring that light. Now, whether that light was operable before the accident or not, we of course can't tell from its condition afterwards, because it obviously would have been damaged beyond operation by the accident itself. Gentlemen, something that I have mentioned to you before, and I'm sure no matter how much I mention it, you will have difficulty in dealing with it. Our law is, as His Lordship will tell you, with respect to the loss of a human being, a very hard law. Mrs. Paget is not entitled to any money for her feelings, for the loss of her husband in any other way except monetarily. It's just the monetary loss that she has sustained. Now, gentlemen, I know that you will be fair to Mrs. Paget. I'm asking you to also keep in mind that Mr. Bright is before you and equally entitled to your consideration and your fairness. It won't be as easy for you to be fair to Mr. Paget as it will be for you to be fair. It won't be as easy for you to be fair to Mr. Bright as it will be for you to be fair to Mrs. Paget, because all your instincts as normal, kind human beings will be to see that Mrs. Paget is looked after. You have sworn an oath, as I've reminded you before, and it's my submission to you that it's your duty to put your feelings aside and to come to your verdict based upon the law as His Lordship gives it to you and upon the facts as you really and truly believe them to be. And I ask you to come to your verdict on that basis and to put another stone into the magnificent edifice of our system of justice. And I submit to you that it won't last a long time after juries begin to make their findings based upon emotion and sympathy rather than on the law and the facts as they truly believe them to be. Now, I'll just take another minute or two to give you my submissions as to what the negligence of Mr. Paget was which contributed to his death. It's not, gentlemen, in my submission to you, Mr. Paget left himself on the traveled portion of a highway in a position of danger and failed to keep a proper lookout for his safety in that position. He failed to see that his wife watched for him. And as I say, he failed to put him, he left himself in that position of danger, even though it was very practicable for him to have put his car where he could have changed the tire without leaving himself in this position of critical danger. Gentlemen, it's my submission to you that he could have driven for the cost of whatever the rest of the damage he would have done to a flat tire, or at most the rim of a wheel. If he'd had to drive 10 miles, in my submission it would have been more reasonable than to have parked the car where he did and set out to change it. Now, gentlemen, I leave you confident that you will fulfill the duties that you have sworn to fulfill, and for your obvious attention, I thank you.
As you may. The advantage of